there, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Speak Dicely, the podcast where I bring in other tabletop enthusiasts and we speak dicely with each other. My name is Teni Brant, and this is the first episode of this series. So I also want to come off top with this. So this current setup that we're recording in today is in a very spacious cottage. I've got some guests with me here. We're socially distant recording. This isn't how it's going to be probably after a couple of episodes. It's probably going to be more like online interviews. But that aside, we're here to talk about D&D and stuff. And I think the dishwasher started again, but you know what? Don't mind that. Anyway, I'd like to welcome my guests. With me today, I have Josh Vardy. Wait a minute. Yeah, you guys have the same last name now. Yes? No.
Yep.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've got Melanie Vardy and Christy Clow. Wow, that isn't the most awkward thing.
I also have the same last name.
So thank you guys for coming to be on the first episode of this podcast.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
I was like
excited.
For a second there, I thought there was going to be like a pause of you guys being like, wait a minute, what do we say to that?
Is it our turn to talk yet?
I'm on a podcast right now. I'm sorry. Could you explain what is a podcast?
Well, Christy, it's when you got a container of something and you throw it really far.
Okay. Yes.
I should make this clear as well. We're not comedians. We're not funny. We're just average people who like to play. Well, Christy's offended, but we're average people who like to play tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, legally, I'm not allowed to declare myself a comedian anymore. So
they took your membership away.
Yeah, the guild, they did. So
the
I'm
guild.
not allowed to.
So, so I just said we're not like comedians or anything, but do you guys kind of want to talk about like what you do?
It's a loaded question because I feel as of the past few months, I don't do much of anything.
Well, that's fair. We are currently in COVID times. This podcast is probably the worst time to start a podcast, or maybe the best time.
I think it's the best. Like, I mean, I say I don't do anything, but these months have made me start to do more creative things. So it's a good time to launch things off, I think.
That's fair.
I work for a college, so I've had my Bachelor of Education and work for a college, and I work for an academic upgrading program, which helps youth and adults get their high school diploma or get credits that they missed, or just kind of get ready again for a college environment. So people come to the program from all walks of life and all different kinds of needs. And definitely here in COVID time, it has been super stressful because all of these folks are people that would do much better with in-person human connection, and the online situation is not going so well, but we work with it.
And for everybody at home, that's Melanie there.
She is the smartest of all of us.
Yeah, and I work at a daycare. So I was teaching kindergarten, and then just recently I moved to working with toddlers. So
you moved to high school. That's a joke, Josh. Again, we're not comedians.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think the guild is coming for you too.
Yeah, so the four of us here, we've been friends a long time. I'm going to be the only really consistent one on this show because I host Dicely. But these guys, you might see regularly, you might not, but you know, it just depends on how available they are. We've got a couple educators, a couple content creators, myself one of those. But yeah, so with this crew I've gathered here today, the whole, or at least two of you had your first D&D experience with me.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of tabletop role playing, we're probably going to be focusing mostly on Dungeons and Dragons. And do you guys kind of want to talk about that first time experience, how it was for you? And Melanie, you can also, whatever your first time experience was, you can also chime in with that. Because I'm pretty sure you mentioned it to me earlier that was with Josh as your DM.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you want to go first, Christy?
Sure. I'm trying to think of the timeline of it because I think that first session happened before I knew anything about Critical Role. Because I think it happened and then it might have been like a year or so later that I started listening to Critical Role, like really getting into it.
That first time we played would have been back in 2016.
Yeah, so I think that's probably, maybe, I don't know. It's hard. I can't remember the timeline, but I do feel like that was like my first introduction to it. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. Like I know some of my friends play, and I was like a big RPG video game fan. So I think like my character was definitely based on the character I play in like every Dragon Age game, which is a a redheaded rogue, dual wielding. But I just thought it was so cool, like especially seeing all the work that you put in, because I still remember you had this incredible map of a city, and I thought it was just insane, like, or insanely impressive.
Yeah, I'm crazy. Thanks, Christy.
I just thought you were like a crazy person.
You're fucking mad.
I was like,
don't mind swearing, by the way.
I literally was about to ask him, like, can I cuss, please?
Well,
I would love to cuss.
Well, there you go. There's your opening.
Fuck yeah. But yeah, I just remember it being really fun, and it went on for like 4 hours, which was awesome. Just like that concept that you can just do whatever you want. You know, I love that.
I'm sorry, Christy, I'm going to stop you there for a second. For the people at home as well, you might hear some background voices as well. As I mentioned, we're staying in a cottage, and we've got like 3 guys on a couch right beside us who are currently playing Mario Kart. So, yeah, hey, Sleek. He's also the one that wrote the theme intro to this podcast. So thank you, Sleek, for that. Yeah. And sorry to interrupt you there, Christy. Just kind of wanted to make any noises explained.
Salik, I will kill you if you ever speak again during this podcast. So trying to talk about things that are really important.
You heard it here first.
Don't use this against me in court, please.
Don't take this. Is this an edit point? Should I cut this out?
I mean, I'll let you decide what you think is best.
No, we'll just delete the whole thing and start over.
This is Dicely, our new true crime podcast, actually.
And it's not like other true crime podcasts where we talk about crimes that have happened. We're going to bring you on the scene as we do crimes.
Yeah, it's like live PD, the podcast.
So welcome to court. We have footage that you've created of you committing these crimes. What do you have to say?
They looked pretty dope, though, right?
That's not me. I don't know who that guy is.
Would you subscribe? I'd subscribe.
Judge, you subscribe, though. You know you do. That's all I had to say. Josh?
Yeah, I remember like going to the cottage that year. We had talked about it a little bit ahead of time, and I had just started listening to the Adventure Zone. And before that, I was interested in Dungeons and Dragons, but I didn't know how to like access it because I didn't know anybody that played. And I didn't know that people would make podcasts or videos of them actually playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. So when I got to the Adventure Zone and figured it out, like it was, it opened my eyes really to what Dungeons and Dragons was and what it could be. And that's when I started to get excited. So then when we played together, I sort of had this idea of how all of these concepts worked, but until I actually sat down with you and made a character and talked a little bit about it, even just for that one shot, then I was hooked because I was like, oh, there's a lot of potential here that like even part of the way through the game, I was like, man, I wish I had like thought of a personality for this person or a story about why they're here, because I remember Carl was playing and he had this wizard who was like just very curious. And so I was like, oh, it would be cool if my person had any kind of like sort of glaring personality part to them. And that's when I was like, oh, I'm going to have to make more characters and find new ways to play because I have to keep exploring the possibilities that are here. So, yeah.
I definitely agree with that because I don't think I really had any. I don't even think I knew that creating a backstory was something that was involved because it was a one shot and you typically don't usually have as well. You could, I guess, but like I didn't know that you could make just like robust.
Right, like how in depth you could go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it was honestly just like, oh, I like hitting things with daggers, and that was it. So, but yeah, I think it was kind of the same. I'm like, oh, it'd be really cool. Like, what else could I do? Like, what other options do I have?
You know, that's a fair point too, because like, yeah, as I ran that one shot with you guys, and typically when I help players, especially new players who are running a one shot, I'm not particularly focused on like, let's flesh you out a character. It's more like, what kind of thing do you want to play as? Yeah, so that I was definitely less focused on setting you guys up with backstory, but I'm glad that was something that you kind of picked up on and were like, I kind of want to do that moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Melanie, for me, like I was resistant, I know, to that like first game, and I decided not to play that particular game. And I think for me, like I had to kind of figure out why all of that was true for me, because growing up, I grew up in a Christian household, and a lot of the media that I consumed and engaged with didn't revolve around fantasy, because there was just there was some things that were strictly limited in my household growing up. Like I remember not being allowed to engage with Harry Potter when it first came out and things like that. So there was certain things that I just never really had experienced. And I also didn't grow up with video games in my household either. So any of the entry points to fantasy in my growing up years were very like limited and would have been presented in school, and not so much in like the reading that I was doing or even in like games. And so like, even though like I love playing board games and I come from a drama background and I went to school for drama, and certainly there was lots of ways that I could have kind of come into the game from those vantage points. And those were the ways that I eventually did come into the game. In the beginning, the idea of a fantasy world felt so foreign that I didn't even know how to engage, let alone something that then on top of that, I didn't understand how the game worked. And so it just felt so far out of my comfort zone that first year I didn't play. I definitely felt disappointed later that I didn't play, I think mostly because it took so long. And so then I know it was just me and one other person that decided not to play. So then it was kind of this like extended time of like, well, what do you want to do now? Like, and everybody else was having fun. But yeah, it took a while for me to feel like I had an understanding of how to even approach the game at all.
You know, that's a very interesting point, because we haven't talked about this previously. To know that like your avenues into fantasy genre, which D&D heavily is. Yeah, I suppose it could be intimidating in that sense, not knowing like the particular like I guess archetypes that fall into fantasy. And in addition to like game rules, because game rules are definitely something that will deter people if you're not helped. Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's something I still struggle with. I've gotten a lot better now because I think I'm about 3 years into experience with D&D, and even then still not a whole lot of experience, because even those that I play with, we try to play bi-weekly, but sometimes that becomes monthly depending on what's going on in life. So yeah, even to this point, I still struggle. Like I remember early on, like something like dual wielding or a dagger is like, what? Like, you know, just like, I know that's a knife, but like, you know, it's sort of like the depth of knowledge is really low. Or even things like ogre versus goblin, like, you know, or that goblins often come together, like just little things like that like I didn't have that experience. And I actually recently I was rereading Alice in Wonderland, and I was saying to Josh, like this would actually work as kind of a cool D&D, because, you know, like you're going on this adventure and you meet like a new person every sort of beat, and each person has like a strength and a weakness, but they don't really know their strength yet. And like, I guess it just made me realize, like, now that I've played enough of it, I understand like how the storyline of it functions so much better. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I feel like now I need to go back and like engage in some fantasy, like even I guess deeper fantasy than obviously Alice in Wonderland. But like, yeah, it just gave me a different perspective on it.
Well, Alice in Wonderland's a very good place to start, especially when it comes to fantasy. So on the, and this kind of topic, I think kind of nicely segues us into, because I think you've touched on this a little bit. What was your perspective about tabletop role-playing games before you actually experienced one? Like, I suppose I should give some context as to like that game I ran for you guys. So like 4 years ago, like a bunch of us went to a cottage, and basically none of you, maybe Carl. Oh, and we had another player there who had played. Like most of you hadn't played before, and a lot of the groups that I play with are usually first-time players, so I've had a lot of experience teaching how to play. And so I think there was about 6 of you who ended up playing that day.
Yeah, it was that. Anthony and Melanie, I think, were the only 2 that didn't play.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was just easy, like, here's a dungeon, here's a bit of a story, which is hilarious because I'm the DM that will always have some sort of story, even though I was like, I'm not going to bother making you guys like backgrounds, which would clearly work with like an actual story. But I was like, it doesn't matter. We're just going to probably smash some things. So yeah, I essentially just ran a one shot for these guys for their first time at a cottage a few years ago. So yeah, you're going back to my question after going on a tangent. What are your guys' perspectives, or what were your perspectives before you played your first game? Like, had you heard about tabletop role playing? Did you like think it was just a bunch of nerdy people LARPing?
I don't think, because at that point there really wasn't as much of D&D and kind of pop culture as there is now with like Stranger Things and stuff like that. So I think all I knew was that it was kind of a nerdy fantasy-esque game. I don't think I knew a whole lot about the role-playing side. I just knew that some of my friends played it and that it was extra nerdy, and that's why I wanted to get into it. I was like, oh, I have like so many stamps punched in my nerd card. I definitely need to add this big one for sure. I didn't have the frame of reference until like after that game. I started watching Critical Role, I think. So
I definitely thought capes were involved.
Oh, yeah.
Just assumed.
they are.
I also thought it was like typically, you know, folks that are very isolated types of people, I suppose would be a way to put that. And I guess I did have an awareness of it being time consuming in general. But I really, other than knowing that I just felt like I had no connection to it whatsoever, I didn't really know a lot about it.
Yeah, I definitely thought that it was a very like a crunchy numbers focused thing for a long time. And I think there is aspects of that, especially depending on the role playing game that you're playing. But yeah, I remember thinking like, ooh, I'm going to try and like maximize different things. And I want to like really focus in on the game aspect of it is what I assumed. But then I think that's part of the reason why I was so captured with like the personality options was because that was something that I hadn't even considered until we played. But yeah, I definitely thought that it was like a more of a less collaborative storytelling and more like crunchy game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So your perspective was more, it was a game as opposed to, yeah, because Melanie was mentioning this before, but the four of us have drama theater backgrounds.
Yeah.
And especially, I think more you three, you guys had improv backgrounds. Melanie didn't.
Not me so much.
Melanie
no.
didn't, but
So-
Josh and I were on the improv team in high school.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
even then, like, I didn't know that improv was part of it. Like, I get that now, and I'm really grateful for my improv background. But when we first played, I'm trying to remember when we first played Talisman, if that was before we first played, like, I first played D&D. Because I think if it was, then I probably was expecting D&D to be pretty similar to that. Just kind of like a very crunchy, like you said, board game without the board kind of situation. But the improv, the role play, the character background, I did not know any of that was part of it. I just wasn't aware that those were options. So,
And it's so weird to me because like my perception of it was so much the opposite. Like I just assumed, I guess, that it was completely like you make a character and you guys all just sit around a table and talk in character a whole bunch and somebody kind of guides fights. Like, but I thought it was like sort of completely open world. And so like weirdly, I struggled a lot with the way the rules are in the beginning because it was like, I guess it didn't feel like anything I'd ever played before, anything I'd ever done. So I just didn't understand how to even approach it because it's like, there are rules, but also there's not rules. Like there's rules, but you can do anything. But if you try to do anything, it's probably going to fail because you didn't follow the rules. But there's not really rules. Like it's just, that's been like a long time struggle. And so even now, like there's times where I'm like, well, like, why can't I try to do X, Y, Z? And it's like, well, you can, but good luck.
Mhm.
So yeah, that kind of took some time because I guess, yeah, the numbers piece I wasn't as aware of. So yeah.
I think too, like those preconceived notions that you have sometimes are either like affirmed or dispelled depending on your first game experience as well. Like the first time we played was not a very crunchy, numbers heavy play session. So I think that affected it. Whereas I think for you, Melanie, when you played with me as the DM, I think because I was such a like laissez-faire DM, I think that maybe that made it a little harder for you in some ways because I wasn't as good at like laying down the boundaries because I was inexperienced too. I don't know if that is true for you.
Well, I was trying to think back to that first game and like I remember like you had kind of brought the group together to focus on doing our character sheets and doing the character building and Certainly I was thankful for that because I had no clue what I was doing. But I remember back to that, we did our character sheet, we did our stats, we did all the dice rolling and all of that stuff to kind of get everything set. And we spent like a little bit of time of like, who are you as a person? But like going through, like when you follow the player's handbook and actually go through like the steps of creating your character, we had gone through, I think, kind of like 3 of 4 steps. And I remember by maybe like the 3rd or 4th time we played, I like had finished finally reading through like all the steps of how to do everything, so I better understood it. And we never did actually do the background thing, which like I know added like a little bit more stats, but added the color that like was like, oh, like, and I guess in a way was kind of the same experience you two had of like not having that background. And I didn't realize like how much that like kind of threw me off early on, like just those extra little bits where you have like a little bit more ability to do this or that or whatever that comes with the background in the written book helped me to better understand why my character would be different from someone else or different than like just the standard. I don't even remember. Do you remember what I played that first? I want to say like a ranger.
Wasn't she a druid?
Oh boy, I don't know.
That was so long ago.
It's so long ago now.
Was this the one you guys are playing concurrently when we started ours as well?
No, we started with The Lost Mines of Phandelver.
Oh, okay,
and then we
okay.
moved into Tomb of Annihilation. And you were a warlock in Tomb of Annihilation, but in Lost Mines, I don't remember.
At some point she was a gnome druid.
For the folks at home, the Lost Mines of Phandelver is one of the first quests that D&D 5th edition tends to promote. Though, from my understanding, it tends to be a pretty party-killing quest, but yeah, that's typically the first one people
Not
experience.
a beginner.
I think that your experience really speaks to how people can react differently to role-playing games, because you needed a boundary in a book that said like you can pick from these couple of options and that will help guide your character. Whereas for me, when I make a character, I think of who I want them to be and then I see how that fits into the book. Whereas you needed something from the book in order to like jump off from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't remember what the background color was that I had chosen, but I just remember it like helping me to settle into who I was as a character, and also to like help me to understand how to react to the other people in my party. And that first group that I played with, I don't think anyone else at the table came from a theater background, so that was also really hard too, because they were approaching the game from like, I just want to kill things with the fun, sharp shit that I have. And that was like their whole thing. Whereas like, I'm often the one who's like, well, can we talk to them? And everyone's like, no, fuck that. Like, and I'm like, no, but like, can we like try? So that was really hard, I think, with that particular group as well. And it made it hard coming into another group where there is more of that flexibility to do that. It's taken a long time to like kind of make that shift back into a more role-playing experience.
Mm-hmm. There's a good point there in that between the both of you, Melanie and Josh, the players will like kind of experience that they have a different way of building a character. Like Josh, you were saying that yours is more like you develop the idea and then you see how the rules can accommodate that. Whereas Melanie's like, you like to see your options presented in the rules and then construct your character that way. And both of these are totally viable for players to build their characters. And it's interesting in that because I'm very much like Josh, I hadn't really considered for players that build their character like Melanie, which I should do moving forward, especially for new players. That's kind of why I skipped like the background for you guys, because I figured you'd kind of develop that idea on your own, be like, I want to make this kind of character. Ooh, here's the flavor. But no, the backgrounds definitely help, especially in your case when you don't know the archetypes of fantasy. So it's just like, here are the options. These are the types of characters that exist. So
exactly. I mean, when Josh said to me like, well, what do you want to be? I'm like,
yeah, you don't have an answer
like,
for
that's
that.
a really great question. Whereas I think my approach comes more from like the idea of like approaching a script and who is your character and how do you come into that character and how do you like respond based on that. And so it was like, I needed the script, and everyone's like, but what do you want to do? And I'm like, I can do anything. Okay, I want to do XYZ. Well, okay, like you can't have magic and also fight well or whatever. You know what I mean? So it was sort of like, I don't know where to start. But yeah, definitely having an experience of like following the character building through, definitely, I guess, connected more to that theater background and like who you are and following it through that way.
I guess kind of moving forward in that, or kind of jump. Did anyone have anything more to say on this kind of topic here?
I fully forgot what the question was
That
that we were answering.
I gotta be honest, I also don't remember. I mean, this is great. We're just chatting. We're moving conversation along.
I think we just started out with like how we felt the first time we played, and we moved into like the first character
Holy
build
crap!
from there.
We're still on this topic.
I believe so.
I think there was
Wow.
one question in between.
There was something in between, but I don't fully remember now.
Oh, preconceived notion.
Oh, that was it.
Oh,
Yes. Okay.
okay.
Yep. No, I
That's
think we
right.
said everything we need to say there clearly.
So you guys have now been playing for a few years. Have you had the chance to experience any other tabletop role playing games?
I don't think so. Definitely not role playing.
Mhm.
Like, I would say, like I've played. I would say there's still RPG games, but never something so role play heavy. Other than like extremely homebrewed D&D to the point that it doesn't even seem like you're really playing D&D, but that's where it got its base from.
When we played the one shot based on Rat Queens, was that still
was still
D&D
Dungeons and Dragons.
focused?
Yep.
Okay, so other than that, no.
No, I would say the closest I've come is being a DM and a player, because to me they feel like two separate sort of games. But outside of that, I haven't really explored any other options. I think it's hard to get other people to buy into another role playing system to try to see if you like it, to like keep going. But
You know, that's a great point. Like, yeah, especially when you've been playing a system for so long and you're like, I know this one so well. It's really hard to be like, yeah, I'll learn an entire new rule set. Yeah, like I've had the chance to play a few different systems like Shadowrun, Pathfinder, which is quite similar to D&D. I started in 4th edition D&D, which is so different from where we are now. But Josh, I kind of want to pick your brain about what was it like being a first time DM, and did you do that very soon after that first time you played as a player?
yeah, it wasn't too long after I played as a player that I DM'd. And I think like a lot of DMs, I was sort of thrust into it because if I didn't DM and start a game, nobody else would, right? So, because I had friends who were like, yeah, I want to play Dungeons and Dragons, but I've never played before, so I don't want to DM. And I was like, okay, well, I've played once and I've listened to a lot of the Adventure Zone, so I guess I'll try it. So yeah, it was a little, I had a lot of things that I hadn't thought through until we started playing, like approaching building a character in different ways, and even some like more practical things. Like I was the only one at the table who had a player's handbook to start with, and the idea of like, I think coaching new players through some of those steps of like, you need to make sure you know what your spells do. You need to make sure that you know what your abilities are. And I can't keep track of that because I'm too busy as a DM. Like when I started, I was like, oh yeah, I'll hold on to your character sheets for you. I'll keep track of your spells for you and like print out spell cards and everything. And then a couple sessions in, I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore because I have to keep all of my NPC character sheets and all of their spells tracked. And I have to, keep track of all of that part of the story. So I can't do this work for you anymore. So I think especially without having played, it was really hard to DM for players. But that's not to say you can't do it. It's just that there's a lot of learning along the way, which I also kind of kept hidden from my players because I don't want to break the illusion of like, I don't know what I'm doing either, guys. Yeah.
That's so true. And for Melanie and Josh, perhaps I can get I can get the both of you to chime in on this, because as a first time DM, and you're like mentioning like, I don't want to let my players know I don't know what I'm doing. But how did you guys feel that first session went? Like, did you guys enjoy yourselves?
Yeah, it was fun. Again, I think like the group that we had, like I said, was very focused on just wanting to beat things up and like, so that also I find is a bit of a detriment in the beginning of a story too, because now that I've done a couple of games, and especially one long form game where you kind of go through the story arc over and over of like, you're in the city, you collect things, you go and you do a couple of things, and they usually exhaust some supplies and stuff like that. And then you get back to the city and then you start over again kind of thing. Missing that beginning part of like exploring the city and getting to know what's around you and collecting supplies and getting ready to go out. I mean, we did those things, but the group wasn't invested in that. They just wanted to kind of get started. And so I think that does take away a lot of that character knowing, I guess, as well early on. The other thing I want to mention too, even just like listening to Josh talk, it's like, you know, he's using acronyms like DM for Dungeon Master and NPC for non-player character.
Yep.
And like, even those things, I'm like, I know what that is now. And like, even those like small things, it's like, I don't know. I take it for granted now because I've played for a while, but it took a long time to like not have to constantly be like, wait a minute, like what are they talking about? So yeah, I guess I just want to also like side note that for like a new player coming in, like don't be afraid to ask what the acronyms are because there's so many. So don't be afraid to like be like, I totally don't know what's going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the introductory series that I've got on this channel, I tried to do that as well. Like anytime or most times I'll be interchangeable between Dungeon Master or DM, or I'll quickly explain like Dungeon Master is DM. But yeah, no, because for our experienced players, we definitely take these acronyms into, we're just so used to these phrases that we're just like, it's second nature. But anyone coming in, that's another wall that they gotta get over.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to, if we know we're playing with new players, we got to make sure that we're accommodating to them. But going back to that, do you think your players enjoyed that first session?
I think they did. I think that the main thing I wanted to focus on is finding what my players were interested in and really leaning into that. And they were really interested in combat and humor, and they really loved the idea of like outsmarting me. So I would intentionally find situations where like I would come up with something or they could come up with something I hadn't thought of, and then they would
Air quotes were there.
Yes. Yeah, I guess I forgot that people can't see me. And they would think that they had outsmarted me, and I would let them think that. Or sometimes there was times where they would genuinely like outthink you, or not even outthink you, but just do something that you didn't expect. And they really enjoyed that. So I tried to latch on to that with them. And I think that helped the session run well, despite all of my unprepared in a lot of other areas. They didn't really notice because they were having fun killing goblins and talking in silly voices and starting a pornographic, like an underground goblin porno ring.
Oh, as you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, some of those things carried through in a way that would happen with any group of friends that have like jokes that everyone kind of knows. So like, I believe one of our character friends had a ladder as well. I think it was a ladder that ladder got poor DM in trouble so many times where it was like, you have this thing that you can't solve. And this friend of ours would be like, well, I have a ladder. And every single time Josh would be like, fuck.
Yeah, you know, like the typical,
you have
like,
that ladder.
You've approached a chasm. How are you going to get past it? And then this guy's like, I put my fucking ladder down. And you're like, oh. And that's fine. For me as a DM, I'm like, that's okay. It was a puzzle. I can throw it away. Yep. And you feel so good about having that ladder that that's all that matters. And the fact that like, you know, I didn't have a really good voice prepared for an NPC didn't matter because you didn't remember that shitty voice. You remembered the time you used the ladder to get across there and you frustrated me. Yeah. And I'm okay to be the butt of that joke.
Over and over and over.
That's so good. It's such an interesting like I don't want to say contradiction, but like, I've been thwarted, but also I'm so proud of you guys for doing that.
Yeah.
It's hilarious to be annoyed, but also proud in those situations where it's like, this is the point. You guys are allowed to be smarter than me, and this is guaranteed to happen at some point or several. Oh, I love hearing those kinds of stories.
It's 5 against 1. Yeah. So at some point, they're going to get you.
It's true. Yeah. I can't be the smartest person out of 6 people.
And I know that Melanie is smarter than me. She's been to university way longer than I went to school for.
But clearly not fantasy university. So I'm catching up.
Where did you? There's Fantasy University. I want to go.
Oh
I want to go there, please.
Could you imagine? Ugh, prices.
I think about it every single day of my life.
Do you think Fantasy University would allow us to like pay half during these times? Would it be online?
I think it would just be in our imaginations.
Yeah, we would
You
just
just
get
kind
like
of
a message
astral-
spell.
Yeah, astral project into school.
So,
yeah, COVID
okay.
can't go into the astral plane.
Yeah.
So as long as you all kind of assemble there,
Yeah.
you're fine.
so next D&D campaign is University.
Oh my God. I'm so into that.
I
Like
literally,
a dorm
I would be
style.
so, yeah, I'm ready.
Actually, that does remind me. I had a DM once run a like school game, and it was so funny. My character died because I don't know, some professor that got fired started the necromancy school underground, and we discovered it, and I got killed by a vampire. I came back. I think this was the dumbest character I've ever made. He talked like this, and I'm here to investigate the murders of the students. Oh my God. Just the stupidest time, but it was so funny, so memorable. I'm sorry. Does anybody want to go on some character tangents?
Like talking about characters I've played? Or
Yeah, sure. You guys still play, so let's talk about some of these characters.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk a little bit about like the first, like after our game kind of, this is going to be a huge tangent though. So if you have other things like
Christy, I want your content.
I'll get my tea, so you go ahead.
Because I was thinking like, so after we played that first game together, I really enjoyed it, but I didn't have any specific plans to keep playing. I thought maybe like once every summer we might do something. And then that fall into December, I guess, I left my job because I just like my mental health was not in the greatest shape. And I ended up being unemployed for a few months from like January to March, maybe. I don't really remember now. But during that time, I used my copious free time to just watch all of Critical Role up into like what I currently produced. And that was kind of like for me, like the first kind of like eye opener that, oh, you can role play and you can have all these character choices. And it was so compelling to me. And it was also kind of a crash dive into the rules. And it gave me such like a strong foundation of kind of how to be in games after that. But even then, like after watching all of Critical Role, my first game that I did with my friends was an extreme homebrew run by our friend Adrian. And it was just off the walls. It was so buck wild. And I played like a ferret or something. And it wasn't a really role play heavy game. And so I was kind of disappointed because I'm like, man, I just watched this incredible show and it like really motivated me and like helped me through that kind of difficult time I was going through, that I just really wanted to do something similar to that. And I don't think it was until we started our game together with Anthony as the DM that we kind of started figuring out like role play. And I think it was easier because we've known each other for so long to be able to do that.
That being these three players here, Christy, Melanie, and Josh, are playing with Anthony as their DM, our other friend and Christy's significant other.
Yeah. And so, I don't know, I think it was almost a good lesson in a way that like not every campaign that you're in is going to be that kind of perfect role play situation and you're so in love with the character and they're going to make all these incredible choices. Like it really is, because it is so collaborative, it's going to be what everyone in the group wants and what the DM is comfortable with. And so it wasn't going to be like, oh, here's my tragic ferret backstory. And, and like, even like, I think we had like a brief something where like, I don't know, we had met up with my family for the first time. And even then it just felt awkward. Like me talking to Adrian as my dad or something. I'm like, I don't know, like maybe I can't do this. Like, but
yeah, you've got certain comforts of role playing with certain people in certain roles, especially.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just something like the more you play, I think the easier it gets to feel comfortable to do that sort of thing. And the more experience you have to know kind of what kind of backstory you can create, and you start getting more ideas for it and everything.
Well, and the group composition, like you were kind of saying there, really informs what the game's going to be. Like if you get a group of people together, I mean, somebody might want to be like, I just want to be the butt of jokes. I'm going to make a pun every moment I can. I'm going to make this serious game into just a circus.
Mm-hmm.
But unless kind of everyone's on the same page of like, this is going to be a serious story. Like we're going to have, you guys have families, you guys have people you know and love. and the DM's awkwardly going to be the person that role plays as those people.
Yeah.
You kind of got to be prepared for those things. Do you, Melanie and Josh, do you guys have characters you want to talk about or any stories about playing?
Well, one thing I was thinking, I guess, too, about the beginning compared to now, because I was thinking about this morning a little bit about where I'm at now as a player. And I still struggle with this, but early on, I really had a hard time with like what I'm supposed to do on quote unquote my turn, because it's not like a board game where it's like, it's your turn and here's the 3 steps you can take and you can take them in this order. And, you know, these are your options. Like, it's not like that, but there is those elements to it. And I think that's where it is kind of murky, because like when you're in combat, there's a turn order and there's rules about what you can do on your turn. And there's things that are outside of those rules and all of those things. And the things that you typically do follow a set of like instructions in order. Like, you know, if you use, like I use my crossbow regularly, and then it has like an additional feature, and then so you have to do that feature first, and then, you know, add your this and that and everything. And even now, like, because I don't have my sheet in front of me, I'm like even struggling to kind of think of like how everything goes in order. But like, I think for me, that was a real struggle, because I really struggle with math, especially like anything that has more than like 3 or 4 steps, or anything in life that has more than a couple of steps, holding all of that in my head and remembering how to do all those steps in order. And that was like a huge pain point for me in this game, because really, like, you do have a lot of options and you use your character sheet to kind of keep track of everything that you can do on a turn. And you can do, like I said, different things outside of combat than you can do in combat, and you can improve different skills. And it is a lot to keep track of. And I think that for me was really hard. And I only feel like now am I kind of getting to the point where like I feel comfortable enough with my sheet, and really I'd like to move into more of like a thought bubble, or like a chain of like, if you do this, then this, and if you do this, then this. Like, I'd like to move it into more of a visual for myself now that I kind of get it better. But that whole like time period of learning took a really long time for me. And I think some of it was like the number of steps you have to take to like have the outcome that you want. And some of it is like not just like naturally having some of those fantasy backgrounds of like, well, obviously you'd use your crossbow for XYZ or whatever. But now, like, I feel like it's only once you kind of get over that barrier of understanding how those like steps work that you can move more comfortably into the role play piece, because until you can do that smoothly, it's hard to do that plus then like add a voice or have emotion or like, you know, be engaged in what's happening in like a character way. Yeah, I think even talking about that now, it's like I realize like how far I've come, and I know that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the DM we have right now. So like this group, yes, like our comfort level as friends really helped, but like over time, I would have never stuck with the game if this group hadn't been willing to like over and over and over again be like, this is what you do first and this is what you do second. And like, holy shit, I'm sick of hearing it. But like, I think I'm like just getting it now.
That's something like I think is so interesting. And I wanted to say this earlier, was you talking about how you didn't come from that fantasy background, I think led you to create or to make more creative choices with things, because I think for Josh and I, we have that kind of, we know like in the books how it goes, in the games how it goes, because we listen to the podcasts and we're big enthusiasts. So it almost like limits us in a way, because I don't know, maybe it's not the same for you, but like I find like
we have these fantasy formulas. It's like this happens, so this happens.
This happens, so this should happen, blah, blah, blah. And so like it almost causes me to stay in a certain lane because it's kind of like what my expectations are for it. But it's really interesting because I do think you kind of come from it from another side. And so sometimes you want to test stuff out. And I do catch myself being like, oh, like, why are you doing that? And thinking like, oh, you know what, that's actually really interesting because I didn't even occur to me, you know? And so it can lead to more interesting moments if you're not necessarily like a huge fantasy head, you know?
And essentially that means Melanie, for a DM like myself, it's like, I know these tropes as well. So it's like, I can kind of predict what you guys do, but Melanie's a curveball player.
She really is, to be honest. Yeah.
She's a wild card.
Well, and I think it's interesting because like going into making a character for the campaign that we play in now, I thought like, I don't want to come up with a character that's like a trope or like a typical male power fantasy character. So I tried to think of like the opposite of who I am. So instead of playing like a 30-year-old dude who punches things, which is not who I am, but I am a 30-year-old dude. I decided to play as a like late 50s woman who has never punched anything in her life because I wanted to go against type. Whereas for you, Melanie, and this isn't meant as a bad thing, but you play a rogue who doesn't know their parents and grew up on the streets, which is a huge fantasy trope. And like every table has that like
fantasy Aladdin.
Yeah, the kind of quote unquote edgy rogue who like doesn't know who their parents are and doesn't care and just gets by as an urchin. But like for you, that wasn't a trope because you'd never heard it before. And so I think you've developed like
and
an
so
incredibly...
She didn't play it as a trope either, which is I think what the most interesting thing. Like, oh, we would know like this is how that story goes. And she was like, nope, it goes this way.
Yeah, and I think like even if you played it beat for beat as every other rogue with lost parents out there has, it's very different for you because it comes from a very genuine place because it comes out of thinking this is a cool story. And I think that's where a lot of those tropes start with is like this would make for a good story and everybody thinks that. And or you think, oh, I've heard that one before, so I'm going to do it too. But for you, you just thought like, this is who I want to make. And you made it. And you didn't worry about like, ooh, is everyone going to think that like I'm that person at the table? Or, you know, is someone else going to have the same idea as me? Because there was no preconceived notion. And I think too, like going back to the like curveball idea, I remember when we were playing last year and we were like going to come to this big climax that Anthony had planned. And Christy and I were there and there was this room, there was 2 doors and one room had caved in and then there was another door and I'm like, I know. And I'm pretty sure you know, Christy, like past that door, there's going to be a portal where there's like a giant big bad guy is going to come out of it. And Melanie's like, no, but this room has collapsed. So something's happened.
Yeah. I was like, I think we need to clear the rocks. And you guys are like, what? Like it was like a moment of like being like if we were in real life, it would be like you guys had just fucking kept walking. And I'm like, but maybe somebody's dead or something. And you guys are like so far ahead of me, like chatting and not even noticing. And it was like, it was a really kind of eye-opening moment for me. And I remember we talked about that at the cottage that year, like soon after that happened. And I was like I didn't like you guys totally were just like, oh, like this is how the plot works. And I'm just like, oh, like what does this like big caved in thing mean to us? And like, I don't even remember, I guess in context what I thought it might mean, but I think I explore differently than you guys do because I guess you guys have a different sense. And like, it's also like, I can't remember, you were talking about something this weekend too, about how you're learning something new and you don't even know what question to ask. And that was like totally my experience in the beginning is like people are like, well, just like ask questions if you have questions. Like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to ask.
That's exactly it. Like if you don't have the boundaries like of knowledge, you're like, well, like, what questions am I, like, where do I start? Right. And so, and I think like you bringing that up last year was super eye opening because I was like, man, like I am really just kind of like following the tropes that I know and not really like being aware or like allowing you to, because I think like we were being very plot driven. And so we really wanted to get to that part of the plot, but you have to remember that it is collaborative. And if someone wants to explore, then you have to be okay with that because it's not your story, it's everyone's story. Right. And so I think that really, hopefully, you know, it's like I try to like be a more like giving player now because like, oh, that was so shitty of me. Like,
and you know, and I can't speak for Anthony on that, but like as a DM, if something were to happen like that, I could totally see myself building a dungeon where it's like this is a blocked off dead end, totally no point to it, but it's a dead end. And if a player decided to pursue that, I'd be like, well, if they managed to clear that, maybe they find a corpse and there's actually a really good item there. Reward the different thinking. Like it's that is so good.
And something else I wanted to say based on what you were saying, Josh, was I forget what it was.
Good point.
No, rude.
Don't worry, we can be sassy on this. We're friends.
Okay. But talking about like having those expectations when you're making a character and being like, oh, like, I don't want to fall into that trope. That's something that definitely I struggle with a lot. Like, oh, I don't want to play this certain type of character because then everyone's gonna be like, oh, like, well, everyone has done that one, you know? And I was like, man, like, it definitely limits you because it's definitely changed the way I pick character traits. And like when for making the one for Dicely, it's why I was like, oh, I can't play an elf because everyone plays an elf. And so I'm not allowed. I'm like, that's some bullshit. I'm like, if I've never played an elf and it's new for me, so that's all that should really count. Ultimately, like it's easy to get kind of trapped in like the expectations of fantasy. Like
I think when you're making a character, it has to be personal to you. And whether you tell the same story that's been told 100 times, that's okay if it's still a personal story to you, right? Like they've told Romeo and Juliet a million times. They've told Hamlet a million times because it's a good story and people remember like when you build on that in a way that is personal. And I think that again, like we said for Melanie, you're playing a rogue whose parents abandoned her in the streets, and that's okay because for you, it's still a story you wanted to make. And I think that's what's important when you're building a character is like, whose story do you want to tell? And it doesn't matter if it's an elf bard or a half orc barbarian that everybody's seen 100 times because you're going to tell it your way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I remember approaching that character building for that one because it's funny, like you're saying, like, well, you didn't follow any of the tropes. Well, I was using the book though, and the book does say like this is what a rogue is, you know. So that was the basis that I started with, but it was also about who else was playing and about myself and wanting to, which, you know, thinking about this now, I'm like, I need to lean back into that again. But like in the beginning, I often in most of the areas of my life, like in my job and a lot of times in group situations, I tend to be a leader. And so in this case, I wanted to be a follower and come from a follower background. And it was okay if my character learned to be a leader as we progressed in the group, but I wanted to be like the part of the reason I picked the rogue was like the idea of like kind of being a loner and how I had kind of gotten into like a bad situation with friends and things like that in the streets. And that like I had went down a path that wasn't really great, but it just was what was working for me at the time. And I wanted a shift and a change. And I wanted to be a bit of a loner and a bit of a follower. And I think I still lean into that when we're fighting. Like obviously partly my weapons force that as well, that like I can't really be in the hand-to-hand combat as much because I'm just gonna die real quick.
Yeah.
But like in like conversation or in like other situations, I'm learning as a character to be a little bit more engaged with the two of you as characters. And also to like still sort of come into my own. And that's like how I wanted to play it, I guess. So I do think if you're starting out for the first time, not that you want to, what's that called when you're kind of like, metagaming.
Yeah.
Like, not that you're trying to metagame when you're trying to like, you know, stand outside the game and be like, how can we make this the best? But like, I think it is good to have a sense of who everyone else is going to play. So you see like how you fit with your group.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. On the topic of tropes there, you guys like hit it on the head. Like there's tropes are a thing for a reason. It's because they work. These are stories that tend to universally be recognized and are relatable to people. And the thing with D&D is punch the microphone. Sorry, microphone. Nobody could see this, but I'm just swinging my arms like crazy. I almost unplugged my headphones there. This is getting hazardous. But
he's too amped about D&D.
But the thing is, like, everyone at the table can be playing a trope. What matters is, like, you're not a character with a trope. You also have to consider you're playing with other people. There's going to be flavor based on how you interact with these regular characters in your character's life. And there's nothing wrong with playing into tropes. The reason that a DM will be like, the party meets in the bar or the tavern for the first session, it's because it works.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm going to kind of segue us here. Thank you guys so much. This has been so enthralling to listen to. This is the first segment. This is Question Dicely. I've been receiving emails, at least from friends. Listeners, we don't have any listeners yet. So listeners, please.
From the future.
Listeners, if you want to send in a question to me to ask whoever me and my guests are, the email is dicelychannel at dmail. That's right. I started a whole new server, dicelychannel@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to read a question that might be pertaining to the topic of the episode. But today's question is coming from Dallas McKenzie. Thank you, Dallas, for sending in this question.
I've heard of her before.
Yeah, well, again, like we don't have any listeners yet, so I've asked friends of the channel.
Sure.
So she asks, what, in your opinion, and we might have already touched on this, was the hardest part of your very first D&D session?
The very first would have been with you, right?
Sure. If you can't think of a specific hard thing for that one, just think of a hard thing.
Yeah, I think I might instead say the hardest thing for like the first like full campaign I was in.
Sure.
Was managing expectations because again, like I said, I was coming off of Critical Role. I really like had an idea in my mind of how I wanted it to go and kind of what I wanted from it, and realizing that it's not always going to be like that was really hard. And like, I feel bad now in retrospect because I definitely was like having that like Matt Mercer effect in my mind, being like, oh, he does this, like he did this in his, so like why aren't you doing that in yours? And like certain rules he has and blah blah. And I'm like, that's not a fun way to play, like you just have to let each campaign be what it is, I think. And that's something I learned after that campaign, which was it was good. I feel bad about it now, but it was good that I learned it. So yeah.
For sure. I get that. And Matthew Mercer is a superb DM, and I've also watched Critical Role, so I'm very inspired by him. But yeah, it's you can't expect every DM or every player to play a certain way or DM a certain way. And that's a very good lesson to have learned.
Yeah, for sure.
I think for me, as I kind of expressed, it was so much learning. And the game wasn't easy for me for a very long time, whether it was like managing all the information and stats on my sheet, or the order that I was supposed to be doing things in, or what my options were, any of those things. And also, like, for a very long time, I often felt like the whole thing was a learning experience. Like, sort of like sitting in a very long lecture on a topic that you're not very familiar with, like you're tired after because you just took in so much new information. And so early on, and really for a very long time in playing, especially because we often would play for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, it was very long and it was very difficult. And I enjoyed the companionship and the time with friends, but it was really exhausting for me for a very long time to be taking in so much new information and managing all the stats and things on my sheet. And so for a long time, it was really hard to feel excited about playing. And even now, like, I'm always excited to connect with friends, but I have to like remind myself that I do enjoy playing, and I still have to like keep like working on that because it has always been tiring for me to play, just because it's so much input, I guess. But sort of on the flip side of that, one thing that really helped me was listening to podcasts a little bit. And I actually listened to a little bit of Dum-Dums and Dragons, I think it is. And they're like a group that also had never role played before. And so that's kind of why that one appealed to me, was because I kind of knew that they'd be a little rocky at it, and like hoped that they would be a little rocky at it so that it wouldn't be so hard to like enter. And they had done the same one that we had played. I don't know if it's the one you mentioned.
Yeah, Lost Mine.
Right. So that actually was really rewarding, because as I was listening, I was like, oh, like I was understanding, I guess, from like an outsider's perspective, how it could have went after I had played it. So that was kind of nice. So like if you are a beginning player or DM, it is kind of nice to start with something that is structured and to maybe hear someone else play the same structure. And I know some people would say don't do that because then you're going to copy it. But I think just getting that outsider's perspective on what it could be so that you kind of understand the structure a little bit better is an option that was really helpful for me.
I wouldn't even say like to people like don't copy anyone else, because sometimes to copy somebody else, there are plenty of people who play better than I do, who DM better than I do, but I will copy them because they're better than I am, and I strive to be better at this. But oh dear, I had another point in crud. Copying. What was the last things you just mentioned?
I was just talking about like playing, like, because there are pre-written campaigns. And so I guess like Christy had mentioned too, that like sometimes homebrews can be hard to jump in on and like manage all the way through. And so I think that a starting player shouldn't be afraid to start with something pre-written, and maybe even to start with a one shot. And it's okay to then listen to someone else do that same pre-written thing, because D&D has touch points, but the in between can be different. Like, I know in the podcast there's a character that's farting all the time, so like that is sort of that joke character that they always go back to that funny piece, and we didn't have that in the same way in our, well, we had it differently in our group. We had the funny character, but they were different. But it was interesting to see them go into the same mine, and I learned a lot about it because they explored so much more of that mine than we did, and it made me realize like how not explorative our group was at the beginning compared to the podcast. So yeah, you can learn a lot in that way.
Absolutely. Like learn from other players, learn from other DMs. You'll kind of learn your chemistry. And yeah, that was very well put.
I think for me, like the hardest thing for me as a first time DM was understanding your weaknesses and really working to shore those up, because I am not very good at preparing ahead of time. So I would just be like, I'll improvise it, because I read a lot of people online who were like, yeah, you should just improvise things. The players will enjoy it better. You'll enjoy it better. And there is that to an extent, but you need to prepare. And I would sort of leave it to the last minute and then prepare. And I always felt like in every session, there was one thing that I was like, oh, I wish that I could redo that encounter or redo that conversation or whatever it is, because I have a much better idea in hindsight about what I wanted to do, or because I didn't write something down, I forgot this really big part that I wanted to incorporate. And now I either have to like sort of backtrack with my players and put it in, or shoehorn it somewhere else that it doesn't really fit in. Whereas if I'd just taken that time to prepare, then I would have ended up with a lot better of a session, because I wasn't as good at improvising as I imagined that I would be in the time. So that was a hard part as a DM. And as a player, I think that like for me, overcoming some of that awkwardness of like, yeah, talking to Anthony and being like, yeah, you're my mom and I'm a 50-year-old woman and we're going to have a conversation about how much we miss and love each other. I think that can be hard. And I think that's what's intimidating for a lot of players, is that they think that when you're new, there's an expectation that you're going to have a flawless character voice and always speak in that character voice and always remember the personality of your character. So I think like that's something that I've been working on as a player for years. And even still, I'll say something that I'm like, oh, my character wouldn't say that, and they wouldn't say it in my voice, and they wouldn't say something that mean or whatever it might be. And I go, like, I really need to, I think that's hard for me to work on switching my brain from like Josh brain to character brain. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And for my own answer, like I started playing much earlier than these guys did. I think it was about, it would have been about 10 years ago now was the first time I played in 4th edition. And I remember my DM, Melanie was talking a lot in this episode about how like there are fantasy tropes. My first DM was very much not that fantasy trope kind of DM. Like there was pop culture references everywhere. Like my first experience was almost like an acid trip. I have never done drugs, but that's probably the closest I came to. One of our players ate Navi the fairy. We fought against the Firefox and the Internet Explorer logos.
Oh my God.
And we ended up getting on a spaceship. Our barbarian skinned the pilot and we flew off into space. Like this, it was crazy. Love you, Zeth. But the reason I wanted to become a DM was because like, I was like, I think I can do this differently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think kind of going on what Melanie was saying, it was exhausting in that it was kind of, we were being ping ponged on different ideas. It was hard to follow. It was an absurd level that I wasn't quite familiar with. And so I think that drove me to want to strive for more plot driven games, more story driven games. Yeah, but I'll always remember my first game. That's for sure.
You always remember your first time.
That's right. Oh, thank you guys so much. This is bringing us to the end of this first episode of Speak Dicely. Do you guys have anything you want to plug? Any social media, any sites, what you do?
I'll plug mine because I'm the only content creator here. So you can follow me on Instagram at Christy Clow, or on YouTube where I'm making some cool, fun, nerdy content. And I would love for everyone to check it out.
Nothing for me.
No?
You can find Melanie
I can't plug
at the
a
college.
toddler room or a college, so no.
We will not be disclosing what those locations are. And again, if you want to send a question in to the Speak Dicely podcast, please send that to dicelychannel@gmail.com. Thank you guys again, Christy Clow, Melanie Vardy, and Josh Vardy. I'm still so uncertain.
Yeah,
That's
and Christy Vardy. Teni Brant.
This is Teni Brant. Am I right? Anyway. So thank you guys for coming in, and thank you everyone for tuning in to the first episode of Speak Dicely. My name is Teni Brant. I can't even get my name. It's
My name is Teni
Vardy. My name is Teni Brant, and I hope to speak Dicely again with you guys soon. Bye-bye. The Speak Dicely podcast is produced by Teni Brant. The intro and outro music were created by Teni Brant. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Dicely DnD. And we thank you for your support.